Hi everyone, my name is Micol Artom, my pronouns are she, her, and my talk today is called To Ask or Not to Ask About Sex. It will delve into meeting the needs of people of different sexes and genders in a national medical triage service in the UK. This presentation is about challenges that me and my team faced in conducting research with people who are trans, non-binary, and have differences of sex development. And my aim is not only to cover the problems, but focus on some of the solutions that we found to overcome methodological and implementation challenges. However, it's important to note that these solutions are based on my own experience and won't necessarily work for everyone. So I would really encourage people to share what worked and didn't work for them in the chat if they experience similar barriers, as we can all learn from each other and improve on our ways of working. I will start by covering a little bit of context, including definitions and statistics, as I feel this is key to understanding the scope of the problem. I will then give a brief overview of the methods and high-level findings, but the bulk of the presentation will be on challenges and possible solutions to them. I will then finish with some key takeaways. So let's delve right in and start with the context. Although these two terms are often used interchangeably, sex and gender are two related but very different things. Sex is formed by biological aspects determined by anatomy. It is produced by chromosomes and hormones and their interactions, and it is assigned at birth. On the other hand, gender is a social construction. It is the perception of oneself, and crucially, it may not match the sex that was assigned to you at birth. Other key terms that need to be understood for this talk are non-binary and trans. Non-binary refers to people whose gender identity doesn't fit comfortably with man or woman, and trans is another umbrella term which refers to people whose gender isn't the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth. Finally, the last group who took part in our research are people with differences in sex development. Differences in sex development refers to a group of rare conditions involving genes, hormones, and reproductive organs. It means a person's sex development is different to most people's. Some examples are androgen insensitivity syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome. Additionally, some people with differences in sex development prefer to use the term intersex, which refers to people who are born with sex characteristics that do not typically fit notions of male and female bodies. There is no one-size-fits-all for these terms, and they're both welcomed and rejected by some people. For the purposes of clarity and consistency, I will be using differences in sex development in this talk, but I do recognize that not everyone in the audience will agree with this term. Before we move on to talking about the research, let's put some numbers to the problem. This will help underline why it is so important to ensure health services work for people of different sexes and genders. The 2021 census was the first to ask about gender identity. According to the results, 262,000 people in the UK indicated that their gender identity was different from their sex registered at birth. This is 0.5% of the entire population. Additionally, catering for trans and non-binary people becomes even more important when we're targeting younger people, as 1% of 16 to 24-year-olds identified as trans. Similarly, every year in the UK, approximately 150 children are diagnosed with differences of sex development, so it is crucial that we do not exclude the needs of these people when developing services. Although the learnings can be applied to any service or product, and that's why we're here, today I will cover research I conducted in the health service I work for, 111 Online. 111 Online is an NHS triage service which helps people when they think there is something wrong with them, but they don't know what to do next. The online service then asks them several questions about their symptoms and directs them to the right place, which could be their GP, a pharmacy, or the emergency department, depending on the severity of their symptoms. At the start of the triage, everyone is asked for their location because the advice is determined by the services available near them. Users are also asked for their age and their sex at birth before they enter what the problem they are using 111 Online is. If they do not enter their sex at birth, they cannot progress any further, and the question currently only has two answer options, female and male. The reason why sex at birth is asked to everyone is because the triage is determined by sets of symptom questions called pathways, and each pathway is categorized by age and gender. Another thing to note is that pathways uses gender as a category, but the clinical need is actually for sex, and the question asks for sex. Pregnancy is a key differentiator for the triage, whereby if you select female, the triage considers you might be pregnant or have recently given birth. However, more than half of the online starting pathways are the same regardless of age and sex, for instance, all the injury ones. So this makes asking for sex for these problems completely unnecessary. So, given all this context, why did we decide to do this research? Because we found that asking for sex unnecessarily and in a way that did not take into account the needs of people of different sexes and genders meant some users were struggling to answer the question accurately, others did not understand why the question was asked, and again, others experienced discomfort in providing this information. Ultimately, the question was preventing people from using our service and stop them from using it again in the future. Moving on to the research methods of what was done. I led on 5 rounds of user research, which included 43 interviews. These were all remote and lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. I spoke to 23 trans and gender diverse users and 10 users with differences of sex development. The focus of the interview was on their experience of answering questions about sex and gender. Yet in later rounds, we tested different designs to improve how information about sex is collected. I also tried to be mindful about intersectionality and included users with a range of long-term conditions, mental health conditions, learning difficulties, sensory hearing and visual impairments, and autism, as well as users from different geographical locations in the UK, ages, and professions. However, the research had some significant limitations that I want to acknowledge here today, including the fact that most users were white and had high digital literacy. Not all differences of sex development were represented in the sample, and there were no gender diverse people in our team. Some of the key assumptions that we tested were that users would rather not be asked any questions about their sex at all. If asked, they expect the question only if relevant. They experience barriers in answering questions about sex, and they don't understand why information about sex is collected, and that makes it even more difficult to answer questions about it. Going through them is beyond the objective of this presentation. However, it's worth mentioning that during the alpha phase, we tested more than 15 different designs. We tested many variations of the "what was your sex at birth" screen, including not asking for sex at birth or current at all, asking for it later in the triage, including additional answers to cater for other sexes and genders. We also tested adding new screens, for instance, asking for people to describe themselves and asking people what their body parts look like. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all the findings from the research here today, but I will quickly go through 4 of the key high-level findings because they may be of interest to some of you and because they also enable you to better understand some of the challenges and solutions I will talk about later in the presentation. Firstly, we found that asking only for sex at birth is a problem because it means that users are not able to share their current anatomy and hormones. Therefore, the service does not consider that bodies of trans people may have changed since birth. For example, the body of the trans man in the quote. He said, "My body is very different from a cisgender woman's body. I have a male hormonal profile, I don't have a uterus, I don't have a cervix, I don't have breasts." It also does not count that bodies of people with differences of sex development may differ from other male and female bodies. This means that some trans people would not answer the current question as intended. For example, they may select their current gender instead of their sex of birth. And some people with differences of sex development would select sex based on their ailment or go back and change the answers. More broadly, we found that forms with binary options make some people with differences of sex development feel unable to fit in. People told us that when they can, they select both male and female options or add another box. However, this is not possible on 111 online. They also explained that adding a "prefer not to say" option is insufficient because it doesn't let them disclose who they are. They also have similar views on other. Conversely, it can also be a problem to prevent people with differences of sex development to fit in within the male and female boxes, because some people do identify as male or female when they have a difference of sex development. Despite it being a difficult question to answer, most users understand the importance of asking for sex at birth to inform clinical triage, as users recognize that some diseases differ between males and females. This was somewhat surprising to us and goes against our assumptions. In fact, some think asking for pregnancy doesn't provide sufficient information. Likewise, some people question whether not asking for sex will make the system more complicated. This means that not asking the question at all to anyone is not necessarily a solution to the problem. The last key finding I wanted to capture today is related to answering questions about sex and gender for someone else. We found that there is a risk that the person who is filling out the form is not aware of the patient's sex at birth. Users talked about certain people in their lives not knowing that they are trans or the details of their transition journey. For instance, the non-binary person in the quote below said, "To assume someone's sex at birth is problematic. Say you're calling for a co-worker, you would not be able to tell if they are trans or not, and you may give the incorrect information." They also expressed concerns about outing trans people before they are ready to when filling out a form for someone else. This is therefore another important aspect to consider when developing services and products which collect this type of information for someone else. Now, let's move on to the methodological challenges we faced and some of the ways we overcame them. As I mentioned at the start, please do share your thoughts about these in the chat, as this will generate interesting reflections for us all. There are 4 key challenges we encountered, which I thought might be applicable to research you may have conducted too. Discrepancies in starting knowledge, difficulties in accessing the right people, mistakes in conducting interviews, and barriers in interpreting findings. When we first started this project, it quickly became apparent that not all people in the team had equal levels of knowledge about this topic. I therefore took a number of steps to ensure this would not impact negatively on the work. I ensured that me and all the team members had a clear understanding of all the basic terminology before we started the research. This includes any terms that I foresaw the participants would be using during the interviews. Then, if something came up that I hadn't heard before, I looked it up and wrote down the definition for the future. I created a shared bank of resources for the whole team to access so that everyone could be on the same page. I then asked people to add to the list as they found more interesting resources, and this means the bank will grow over time. Another thing I did was to try to be very honest with myself and my team with what I knew and the gaps in my knowledge. Likewise, I created a safe space for people to ask questions and share their thoughts when they did not understand or agree with something. Finally, something that has been really key for us was to meet with supporting stakeholders before starting the research so that they could raise things that we should keep in mind when preparing for the interviews. These allied stakeholders advised us on how to approach the work in the most appropriate manner and later helped us with implementing change, but I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. There were a number of barriers we faced around accessing the right people. I will start by talking about broad solutions and then move on to specific ways in which we designed the participant information sheet and the screener. This may seem obvious, but after waiting for days, sometimes weeks, for charities to get back to me, I realized that I needed to plan extra time for recruitment of participants. It takes a lot longer to recruit by charities compared to using panels or agencies, especially if they are small and don't have dedicated staff for recruitment of their members. Something that people may not have expected to do is to allocate a budget for recruitment when going via charities. When I started the research, there was no process in my organization to pay charities who helped us with recruitment. I therefore set one up so that they would be paid in the same way we would compensate a recruitment agency for their time. A small action that made a big difference to me when pursuing multiple recruitment avenues at a time was creating an email template which explained the context of the project and what I needed. I also had a spreadsheet for keeping track of who contacted already, so I didn't reach out to people more than once or miss valuable leads. Finally, for the first round of research, my main aim was to recruit people who were trans and non-binary, which already wasn't easy. However, as we planned further rounds, I started to be more mindful of not excluding people from certain groups. In fact, a sample cannot be representative without taking into account other factors aside from gender, including ethnicity, age, and digital literacy. In order to do this, I contacted specialized charities, for instance, those focusing on Black LGBTQ members, and that turned out to be really helpful. Difficulties accessing the right people were overcome also by how we designed and iterated upon the participant information sheet and screener. In the first round of research, although I had explained that we were looking for trans and non-binary people, we had one respondent who we found out during the interview only had an interest in the topic and wanted to share his views on developing services for these users. I therefore later changed the wording to make it extra clear that you needed to actually be part of these groups. Although this is best practice anyway, given the very sensitive nature of the interview, I was mindful about providing specific details of what exactly to expect, so that people could make an informed decision whether to take part or not. This meant, for instance, sharing the questions of the interview in advance for those who asked for them. I also put my name and contact details, not just a general researcher inbox email, and offered pre-interview telephone or email chats to people to address any concerns that they may have. Something else I did which helped us build trust with participants was to let them know in advance that the researcher will have their camera on, but they had a choice whether they would like theirs on or not. And actually, a lot of people decided to keep theirs off, and that was perfectly okay. Likewise, I informed participants about observers in advance and allowed them to say that they did not want any. The screener was something very hard to get right, and I tried to improve on it every round. Initially, I asked everyone for both their biological sex and their gender identity. I then asked myself, is asking for sex necessary? How will it make the participant feel? I therefore stopped asking for their sex and left only a question about gender identity and one about differences of sex development. I also iterated on how we were asking for gender over the rounds. For instance, in the first round, we had radio buttons, which meant that people could only select one option. However, after feedback from participants, we changed it to tick boxes so that they could select more than one. We were also using the terms trans male and trans female, and later changed it to trans man and trans woman. What really helped us, apart from feedback from participants, was showing all the research materials to relevant stakeholders and the charities who were helping us recruit. I would therefore really encourage you to have some in your corner and do the same. Before we move on, I wanted to share how we ended up structuring these two questions about differences in sex development and gender identity, based on the feedback that we got. For the first question, we asked, do you have a difference of sex development? And then added the explanatory text. This is a condition involving your genes, hormones, or reproductive organs, including genitals. That means your sex development is different to most other people's. If people selected yes, they had a free text box where they could explain more about them. For the question about gender identity, we had the following options. Male, female, non-binary, trans man, trans woman, I prefer to use my own term, prefer not to say. We debated at length whether we included enough options, as we know this is not an exhaustive list. However, we didn't want to make it too confusing for people. It would be great to hear how you have been asking people about these aspects, because again, I think these questions could be improved further in the future. The third methodological challenge I wanted to talk about is making mistakes in interviews. Ethically, we have a duty of care to ensure our participants aren't harmed by their involvement in research. There are a number of strategies that can be implemented during the interviews to try and avoid this. Before the start of the interview, I reminded the participant what would be covered and checked that they were still comfortable to proceed. I always introduce myself at the start of the sessions with my name, my pronouns, and my role. If the participants share the preferred name or pronouns, I ensured that I used it correctly throughout the interview and during the analysis. I warned participants before showing them content that I thought they might find particularly triggering. Lastly, when the participants shared something particularly sensitive, I thanked them and acknowledged how difficult it may have been to share it in the context of a research interview before moving forwards. There are also actions I took before and after the interview, which I think helped overcome challenges. I limited the number of observers. These were really interesting interviews and lots of people from the team wanted to be involved. But I knew that participants could be intimidated if there were too many people watching. And this was not an easy fight to fight. For the observers who did attend, I provided clear instructions about how to act in the research sessions, including joining on time, off camera, and on mute, not interrupting during the sessions, not forwarding interview invites to other people without asking. After the interview, I was very clear with the participants about what the next steps for the research were, what the possible outcomes of the research might be, and the predicted timelines for it. This is because I think it's really important for the participant to have realistic expectation about what will happen and when to avoid disappointment. What I also found is that the complexity of these topics sometimes makes it difficult for people to easily formulate their thoughts on the spot. I also therefore started giving participants the options to send me an email within a time frame with things that they did not get a chance to share in the interview or that they may have changed their mind on following reflection. Finally, I always planned sufficient time to do a debrief with the observers and the note takers who were in the interview. The debrief was not only a way to identify key insights from the session, as we normally do, but also a safe space for people who attended the interview to share how it made them feel and ask for any support that they may need. The final methodological challenge is related to barriers in interpreting findings. I will talk about challenges and solutions during analysis and then during dissemination. Unfortunately, we didn't have budget for professional transcription, but I did try to transcribe most of the interviews myself and crucially get as many verbatim quotes as possible. However, if you have time and budget for transcription, I would very strongly recommend using it for this type of sensitive research. I gave myself additional time for analysis and write-up, which increased my rigor. But what really made a difference was before the write-up, sharing the initial analysis with other team members who observed the research to sense check what I had identified and ensure that there weren't any gaps. I found that often people had noticed something I hadn't or had a different interpretation of what the participants said. So doing this made the analysis a lot richer. In terms of barriers during dissemination, in the same way I did when planning the research, I assume that people will not always be familiar with the terminology and provided additional background information every time I played back the research. Something that we did and we don't normally do, but I'm very proud of it and would really like to integrate in all our research practice, is that we shared high-level anonymized findings from the research with the participants who took part. And this was to enable them to appreciate the value of their contribution, but also to allow them to rectify anything that I may have misinterpreted during the analysis. As a final note, I wanted to mention the need to manage strong opinions. As a researcher, but also as a person invested in making services more inclusive, I found it very difficult to witness comments from people who have opinions different to mine and have offensive comments around inclusive design work in general. This happened mainly when we recruited via social media. Reflecting on the process, I think it's important to be prepared from the start that not everyone will think about things in the same way as you. And ultimately, this is one of the reasons why we do user research in the first place. The second aspect I wanted to cover today are clinical communication challenges, or better, challenges that me and my team had in communicating the outcomes of this work to our stakeholders, and more specifically, the clinicians working on the triage software that we use, which is Pathways. There are two main challenges I will talk about. The first one is how some of the clinicians struggled to understand the negative impact of the sex at birth question and were unclear as to why it may pose a problem to some of our users. And the second is about concerns in changing how the triage is designed right now, even if it means improving it. When I presented the outputs of the first rounds of research, everyone in the audience was very interested in the findings. This was research done with a new user group, which had rarely been done in my organization before. However, when it came down to actually thinking about implementing new designs and making changes to the system, we received a lot of pushback. Surprise, surprise. How many people was it actually affecting? Was it really stopping them from using the service, or was it just causing them a bit of discomfort? We therefore realized that presenting insights wasn't enough. We needed to use the same language as the clinicians if we wanted them to listen and understand. We did this in two ways. Firstly, we worked with a friendly clinician in the team to really break down the problem into causes, impact, and risk. At its core, the way we were asking for sex had two main issues. Some users answer the question incorrectly, and some users don't answer it at all. They answer it incorrectly because they don't understand the question, they can't answer it because they have a difference of sex development, or they interpret it as current rather than sex at birth. This means that they move through an inappropriate triage, and the risk is that the triage misses potentially relevant information, for instance, a pregnancy, and the user is given an inappropriate outcome. For instance, to go to their GP tomorrow as opposed to the emergency department right now. Similarly, the users don't answer the question because they don't understand it, they can't answer it, or they experience distress in selecting one of the options. This means they don't undertake the triage at all. And the risk here is that they don't get the help they need now for their health problem, but they also might not access the service again in the future because it did not meet their needs the first time they used it. The second thing we did was create some scenarios which helped bring the research to life when presenting it to clinicians. We had many different ones, but I will describe two of them to you here today. The first example is one of a non-binary user who goes to 111 online because they have abdominal pain. When they get to the sex at birth question, they select male because there is no non-binary option, and they experience extreme dysphoria selecting female. They then select that they have a stomach ache or pain in the category list. However, given they selected male for the sex question, they are not displayed the questions about a chance of them being pregnant, nor the one about having a baby in the last 7 days. This means that if they are experiencing abdominal pain due to something like an ectopic pregnancy, this could be potentially missed. The second example scenario is one of a person with partial androgen insensitivity syndrome who is experiencing abdominal pain. This is a condition whereby the person may have fully or partially undescended testicles. In the sex at birth question, they select female because there is no option for them to select that they are intersex. This means that they are not asked questions around their penis, testicles, or scrotum, which might be relevant. For instance, they're not asked, do you have any new pain or swelling in your penis, testicles, or scrotum, nor whether they have any pain in their penis. Overall, having these scenarios and working on them with the clinicians was a really compelling way of demonstrating that these were real issues that could affect real people in very significant ways. So something needed to change fast. The final major challenge I wanted to talk about today is clinicians' concerns about changing the standard triage. Maybe not on this aspect specifically, but I think it's quite common for stakeholders not to want to make changes to our services because they fear it will make things more difficult for the majority of people. In order to address these concerns, what we did was to identify all the pathways that did not use gender logic, i.e. where gender didn't matter, and proposed to remove the sex question from them. We also proposed to move the sex question to after the pathway selection, so that it is asked only for the health problems where knowing people's sex is actually relevant. Finally, in the rare occasions where we still do ask for sex, we propose to do it in a more inclusive way by asking people to tell us what their body parts are right now. Indeed, this not only makes the experience significantly better for people who are trans, non-binary, or have differences of sex development, but also removes a question and therefore makes the journey quicker and simpler for people who identify as male or female too. I wanted to finish today's presentation with some key takeaways, but thank you for listening so far. I really do believe this is important work, so it's worthwhile doing even if it's really difficult and time consuming. If you're planning on starting out on a similar journey, please do be mindful of the limitations. For instance, look at how your team is structured and think whether you have people in the team who have some insight into the experience of the user groups you will be researching. Unfortunately, the road to implementation is extremely long. We started this work a year and a half ago, and none of the changes that I discussed have gone live yet. There will be many other discussions about technical and clinical challenges required before the designs can actually be developed, and I acknowledge that sometimes this can be quite disheartening. Finally, if you're doing similar work, I think it is key to share the learnings and knowledge that you have acquired by doing it, even if what you did isn't perfect. I know for sure that what I presented here today isn't. Sharing means that you can inspire others to do more and better research, but you can also exchange ideas with peers so as to improve your work in the future. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate all the comments and questions that you've put in the chat so far. I now welcome any other questions that you may have.